Back a year ago.
This episode of the Beer Bound Podcast is brought to you by Rolling Hops Beer Tours.
Hey everybody, Garrett here from Rolling Hops, as always joined with my partner,
Andy.
We're here to tell you guys about our virtual craft beer tour offering. With what's going on in the world, unfortunately, we haven't been able to run our historical craft walking beer tour, so we've pivoted to taking the virtual experience of craft beer directly to you guys. Wonderful for team building events, corporate events, even just a night out or in, for that matter, with your friends and family. And we're doing this online.
Have any questions about the beer tours or want us to tailor make an event for you? Just shoot us an email or send us a message on any form of social media. Rolling Hops, you can find us everywhere.
RollingHopsBeerTours.com is where you can get a hold of us, and we'll see you guys soon.
Cheers.
Welcome everyone to another episode of the Beer Bound Podcast. We are excited to be joined by Matt Enns from Maker's Malt. These Canadian Maltsters can be found in Rosthern, Saskatchewan. As an expert malt barley farmers, they are passionate and connected to the land in which they live. Concept of doing startup craft malting of a craft startup malting operation was born out of the success of the recent craft beer movement. So Maker's Malt saw a disconnect between the needs of local craft brewers, distillers, and their typical source of malt that they needed supplied. Maker's Malt targets audience of craft brewers and distillers, and they create malt crafted to their customers' needs. Maker's Malt brings life to the products that their partners create. So without further ado, we welcome Matt to the Beer Bound Podcast. Welcome, Matt. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, great to be here.
Awesome. So maybe you can kick it off a little bit and just tell us a bit about yourself and your history in malting and agriculture.
Yeah, so I guess I was born into a third generation farm operation. And so, my great grandpa had come over from actually like the Ukraine, Russian region, which is in the news today for sure. And kind of with the, strife, war and strife, the Bolshevik army had come through. They were Mennonites, so they were kind of getting ousted from the area. And they came through with like whatever they could carry on their backs kind of thing. And at that time, there was a push to get immigrants out west, and the Mennonites knew farming. And so they settled in certain pockets. And in our area, the Rosthern area was one of the pockets. And my grandpa then kind of, took on a mixed farm. And I remember something that just kind of, is poignant to me is like when they were married, my grandpa and grandma, they got a dairy cow, and that was like by far their most valuable possession because it was, giving them sustenance every day. And so that's kind of like, the history. And then my dad, he grew up in that mixed farm, but he really liked grain farming. And so by the time I kind of became, I guess, an adult, we were mostly into grain farming. Certainly when I was a kid, there was dairy, there was still chickens. So there's still all those kind of chores. And now it's kind of all down to grain farming. But it's a little bit more complicated than that because I wasn't really, just kind of born and bred to be a farmer. And in fact, my dad said to me many, many times growing up that you're just not a farmer, are you? And so I never knew quite how to take that, but yeah, oh, exactly. So I kind of, I went away to university, had a degree in physical therapy, worked at that for probably 10 years while also always being a part of the farm. So I would go back for seeding and harvest. Initially, it was kind of like, juggling two jobs. And then after a few years of experience, I was able to actually write those times off as unpaid leave into my contracts. So I would have the seasonal times to go help on the family farm.
Right.
And eventually, I guess it'd be about 2010, a neighbor's farm went up for sale and we were able to kind of purchase that, and it gave us a little more size, so it was easier for me to join and get some skin in the game. And a few more years of working 2 jobs, and eventually probably around 2014 or 15 I was just farming. So that's kind of the farm history. And my dad still farms with me today, going strong in his mid to late 60s. So
Nice. It's good. That's good heritage.
yeah.
Well, I guess you kind of showed him, right? You kept the farm going. Now you're a farmer, so that's good. That's great. So it sounds like, farming hasn't necessarily always been a passion of yours all the way up through your entire life, and you've worked at it for the most part. Has beer always been maybe a passion? Is that kind of maybe as a farmer of grains, is that one of your favorite beverages, or do you have to grow into that as well?
I would say 100% grown into it. So a few reasons. Like, I think one is Saskatchewan, we're not always the first place to get the new hit song, right? Like, the same thing is true with craft beer and local beer and that type of movement. Like, the maturity of the marketplace isn't where it is in Toronto and Vancouver. And so, if I go through my university years, craft beer wasn't really accessible in any shape or form in our area. And if it was, it would be like, I don't know, you'd be just as likely to get maybe like a US craft beer that's a national brand versus anything else, right? So then the other side is, Mennonite, right? So growing up, my grandparents would never have touched, alcohol or beer. Our town kind of has a mix of Mennonite, Ukrainian, and Indigenous and other people. And so, lots of people, drank beer, didn't drink beer, but it wasn't something that was I would say as common in my family as probably on average. And so going up and through my 20s, I was not really a beer drinker into at least through my early 20s. And now, at this point, I would say most people would be pretty hard pressed to have as many eclectic craft beers as I do, just, through my malting and, own personal pursuits. So yeah, I mean, almost from 0 to 60 in a lot of ways, kind of over the last 8 to 10 years.
Fair enough. I feel like that's been sort of the story for craft beer over the last 20 years or so. It sort of exponentially exploded. And well, obviously we're a little biased over here at Rolling Hops, but in a good way. Everyone gets a little taste of it, with it growing that much and expanding across Canada. And I guess maybe to your point, there wasn't that many big brands, and you could probably find a whole lot more now in this day and age.
Oh, yeah.
So
for sure.
Which is always a good thing in our opinion. We're all for options and diversity and variety, and letting everyone have a little bit of that pie. So it's definitely a good thing. So as a craft maltster, what's a typical day in the life look like?
Well, so if we narrow it into the malting part, production is always running. So in our facility, and I would say in most, it's almost a 24/7 kind of practice, because you have a batch that will take 7-8 days, something in that realm, and it's got to be moving in some part of the process for that whole time. And so there isn't really full on downtime or full on weekend involved unless you have enough people to take shifts. So you're always in production at some level or another. And a lot of production is just, monitoring, making sure things are doing what they're supposed to, taking a few tests, making a few minor adjustments.
Checks and balances. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then other parts are actually physically moving grain, packaging, doing deliveries, taking orders, some of the same stuff that's typical to most businesses. And, I would say the typical day can be a bit dusty. It can be a bit loud. it's kind of varied, especially because malting runs through different stages. And so you're kind of checking for different things at different days. And really so if I take it back to our own personal scenario, we're also farming. So we're growing all of the grain that we malt, almost all. And so that's a real seasonal curve for us, right? Like seeding will start around May 1st, give or take. And we'll be busy through the summer with little kind of slowdowns, but we'll be really quite busy through till September, October, where, hopefully harvest is done in September, but many years it isn't. So and within those seasonal times, like seeding and harvest, you're probably looking at 15, 16-hour days on the farm side, never mind the malt side. So it is kind of ebb and flow a little bit, but yeah, I think it gives you a little window anyways.
Yeah, 15, 16-hour days. Well, obviously, there's a passion behind that, and you have to be maybe a little cut out for it. But like you said, it's seasonal, so I guess there is downtime. Maybe the winter months are known as quote unquote a little bit more of a downtime. So is there any part, do you prefer one maybe over the other? Or are you like more inclined on the growing side or the farming side as opposed to the malting?
Well, I would say that if I look at my role on the malting side, like there's some guys that help with production, but I really lead the push on that side strongly. And on the growing side, farming side, my dad would still kind of lead that push a little bit. And so sometimes it's just role based. Like, could I do all the things that my dad could do? No, I don't think so. Could my dad come in and do the malting things that I do? Definitely not. He has no experience or interest in taking that part on. And so my role is certainly to run the malt house and then make sure that I'm doing the things on the farm that are necessary during the seasonal times where we really need the extra help. And then I'll step kind of back out of day to day on the farm to run the malt house. So and I really do like them both. They're very different. One of the things that I love about farming that is difficult with malting is the seasonality versus the 24/7. So I found that really interesting over the last 4 years since we've been running the malt house, is that you don't get to turn it off very easily. And farming's become worse that way over, the last 20 years too. If you ask a regular farmer, especially out in Western Canada, like it used to be the winters were off for like coaching your kids in hockey or joining the curling league or whatever you want to do. I don't know. But now, I mean, it's such a complex business for most efficient, survivable farms, that you're selling commodities, you're tax planning, you're cash flow planning, you're working with old and new equipment, whether it's maintenance or purchases and lease backs, and it's just a pretty wide, complicated business by now that January, February is probably not quite as slow as it used to be when I was growing up, but it's still different than malting, where you kind of have to literally have someone look, aware of what's happening all the time. So
always a thumb on the pulse, right? Like you said, it doesn't stop. And that's that's interesting what you said about the farming aspect and the downtime used to be there, but now there's always these things. I guess I know from reading researching some of your stuff on your website, like you guys are still, from what it sounds like, let's say a relatively small operation compared to some. Is that fair to say?
I don't know. I don't think I'd characterize this as small. I'd say like we're kind of maybe middle to slightly large on our farm side. On our malt side, we're really small. So for context, this, like, we will have seeded over 10,000 acres last year of grains in one form or another. And each how do I make this best for comparison's sake? So of that 10,000 acres that we will have seeded, we could probably run the malt plant on a couple hundred. So,
okay.
So it's maybe about 2 to 3% of our acres that actually gets, the cream of the crop brought into the malt house and processed. And that's partially because we have a rotational cropping system where we're rotating usually canola and then barley and then a pulse, like a lentil or a pea. And that's, as a soil health practice,
Right.
you want to rotate the crops for basically the legumes will fix nitrogen, right? And they're good for the soil. And then you also rotate the amount of disease that's present by changing the croppings. And it's just the right way to kind of protect your soil, right? And so we're always rotating things. Our barley is never really over a couple thousand acres at the most. And even from there, as you can see from what needs to go into the malt house, a lot of it will go into the commodity system at the end of the day. Right. So the scale is actually one of the really interesting things about what we do. I just did a talk the other day, and on the year that we grew the most barley on our farm, we grew enough barley to make 150 million beer. And it's like, where does it go? Because like Saskatchewan only has 1 million people total. And so it's obviously not being consumed in Saskatchewan. We're just one farm out of thousands, right? So the scale kind of blows your mind, because that is going out across the world to China, to Japan, to the US, but it's so commodity, right? Like you grow it, you do it really efficiently. You're trying to do your best to provide a good, healthy product, but you're waving at it as it leaves the farm and you never see it again. You don't know what it's doing, right? And then you move into the malt plant, and like, I'm not selling 42-ton super bees anymore. I'm selling like sometimes 2-pound bags of malt to home brewers. And it's just like, this scale there's such a crazy disconnect here. And that is partially why we stepped in there, because we thought, the commodity system is built for kind of the first part of that conversation. And the craft brewing, distilling ecosystem is really totally different. And so our malt plant is much more designed to support our local brewers and distillers. And we do have a pretty nice market share in Saskatchewan, but it's tiny compared to Western Canadian cropping.
Right. Okay. No, that puts it in great perspective. I'm no farmer, city boy in Toronto, obviously, this is all interesting, but I think, you explained it quite well for me there. So it sounds like, like you're saying, the malt house is a little bit more of a smaller operation, but obviously your farming is still quite large. And then, to your point there, you have different customer bases for each. So with that, like you said, a good majority of what's farmed is actually, put into the commodity system, and I guess, purchased in larger bulk, but you take the smaller portion of that and that goes into the malt house. So how do you distinguish what are that small percentage? I think when I was reading on your website, it's anywhere between 5 to 10%, I believe, that goes into the malt house. So how do those grains make the cut?
Well, that's like kind of a question where I can go superficial to start and just say the best stuff goes to the malt house. So it's like, if I was a vineyard, I'd have my reserve plots, and that would be my, top-notch stuff. And I'm going to malt it, send it to my customers, right? But it kind of goes deeper than that, because that vertical integration that we have between growing and processing has really allowed us to understand what qualities are important to our own process, but also to our customers. So on the commodity side, like I said, you grow it, you think you did a good job, and you wave at it and you never hear anything. And even if someone did have a comment, it's impossible for them to really comment back to you directly, because it's been blended with 1,000 other farmers' crops who all have different practices, and kind of made it to a homogenous blend, right?
Here's your giant barrel or bag of wheat that
got
a stamp on it, says it's good, and there it goes.
Yeah, it's on a train car, right? Or even bigger yet, on a cargo ship. And so with our stuff, because we're so small and directly connected to our end user, we get that feedback directly back. Okay, how is this working for you? What would you like to see? Is it a flavor profile thing? Is it a performance thing? What do you want us to work on? And so between what we see in our malt house and what our end users tell us, we've actually been able to go back to our farming practices and change the agronomics for those reserve plots. And it's a pretty interesting conversation to have, like with my dad, and he had a 25-year partner who just retired this year actually. But those guys were known as the best malt barley growers in their area. And so, a year into this, we're doing trials every year, researching varieties and agronomics, and I'm learning more and more. And I'm going back to these guys and saying, like, actually, you got to do it like this. And they're like, well, we've been like kind of well recognized, for like 30 years here. Like, what? Why? And part of the thing that happens on the farm is that you have to think about money. You have to think about, are we making as much money as we can efficiently as well, right? Mm-hmm. And that's another beauty of the malt house, is that we can, for those particular acres, kind of disregard that metric a little bit, not totally, but in philosophy, philosophically, we can go fully quality over quantity. So we basically go into it and say, okay, what agronomics are going to produce the malt that's going to process the best? It's going to have the highest efficiency. It's going to bring in unique flavor profiles, and go after it. And then we use a single malt philosophy, so it's never blended batch to batch. Everything's traceable back to its field of origin, and we know the practices we used on each plot, and so we can kind of fine tune that. And it was quite interesting. I think we're still actually extremely unique in taking that learning from the processing side and back up the chain to changing our farm agronomics. Even amongst craft maltsters, like there's only so many that are farming and malting together. I'm on the Craft Maltsters Guild board, which is mostly US craft maltsters and a sprinkling of Canadian ones. And I don't know what the percentages would be, but they're not really, most of them aren't farming as well. And so we do have a kind of unique capability. There's a couple guys that I know that do it. And if you want to narrow it down even further, there's only a few that do it in real barley country. There'd be like a couple in Alberta, myself, and then, a few, 2 or 3 in the US. And then after that, it's like, people trying to make it work in a environment that maybe isn't optimal. So anyways, so how does it make the cut? Being the best. And then we actually curate it to be the best because of what we've learned with our relationships, I suppose. Yeah,
that's cool. Yeah, it gives you that that little bit of an edge. The fact that you take stuff right from the growing of it and into the malt house, and then, like you said, you have connections with your end consumer, so it can give you that. And I guess that just helps you even further, telling you, okay, what actually makes the cut as the best, and you could tweak that as you go along. So that's really interesting. Sort of 100%. Owning all the points along the chain is really cool. So I think you briefly touched on the growing side. It gets pushed into the commodity market. You take some for yourself, but when you're on that malting side, when it leaves the malt house, what are some of your endpoint customers? Are they mainly just brewers, distillers? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I would say our typical customer is a Saskatchewan brewer, craft size, and we do also have a number of distilling customers in Saskatchewan, and we do push further out from Saskatchewan as well. So we kind of have 10 to 12 real core customers that use our malt for their entire production, unless there's something that we maybe don't produce, right? Like, right. A really dark roasted malt or something like that. So those 10 are really core to our business model, and they'll take up, I don't know the math exactly, but about 70-80% of our malt. And then we have the customers that'll use us for like special projects, or they'll use some of our specialty malts in some of their recipes. So they're not using us for everything they create. They're using us, for little bits and pieces. And again, those guys are concentrated in Saskatchewan, but we've done malt in many different places. Winnipeg is another community that we get quite a bit of sales into, and it's definitely the place we focus on the most after Saskatchewan. And we've had malt go as far afield as Orlando, Florida, where we do annual beer called the Laureate Lager that won an award in its first year that they made it. So they're forced into doing it every year, it seems like.
Congrats, maybe.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's awesome. My sister-in-law lives in Orlando. We've got some like connections there. And so I'm able to we go out here every winter. In fact, that's a little bit of the origin story of Makers as well. It has its roots in Orlando, but we come out here every winter, and I'm able to tell my friends and family out here that that's Saskatchewan barley, not only Saskatchewan barley, but Makers malt, and a number of our unique specialty malts are in that beer over there. Go try it out. So it's a special project for me for sure.
That sounds very fulfilling, I'd say, right? It's like you grew it, you malted it, you're halfway across the continent, and you can enjoy that and tell people that you produce that. That's pretty cool.
Cool.
That's really interesting. So you said you obviously distribute outside of Saskatchewan. Is there any plans to maybe further distribution and increase, I guess, maybe the scale of the malting business?
Yeah, so there is. We're currently undergoing what I call a bridge expansion, and it's basically within our existing malt house footprint, adding a steeping vessel and streamlining a bit of our grain handling. And so we estimate we'll have about 35% more capacity just based on those processes alone. And it's pretty low hanging fruit compared to the initial startup. And so that's ongoing right now. It's agonizingly slow because of supply chains and equipment. But we're coming through into at least to the part where we have it in house, and it's up to us to get it done. So we're getting close there, and that's going to give us, like I said, a little bump. So last summer we were basically maxed out the whole time, and had to say no to a number of customers and interesting projects in terms of supply, which I didn't love. So this was kind of our quickest, easiest way to up production. And then we do have a plan to kind of increase our size and our scope a little bit. It's more of a 2-year out plan, but I'm doing a little bit of research. There's lots of things about it that I really like, including the sustainability model and conservation, even at the third phase, the farming side, but also in the processing itself at the malt house. And we also want to be able to put it on display and do a bit of agritourism through this next facility, whereas our first facility is much more production based. But as farmers, we feel and this is why, coming on a podcast like this is important to me. I love it, is that we don't really have a chance to showcase ourselves to the big populations of Canada. People in Rosthern, in my town, they mostly, I shouldn't even say that, but a lot of them are not that far from the farm or from a rural upbringing or from someone that farms, right?
Right. Yeah.
And as you take those steps further, okay, the big city of Saskatoon, you might have heard of it.
I have.
Yeah. So I mean, people are slightly less connected, and I lived there for 10 years commuting to farm, right? So I kind of see that. And then I have this experience in Orlando where we've come down every winter, and for a good chunk of time, of the people here, and they just have a really different view of what we do. In a lot of ways, it's a nice view, and people are like, oh, you farm? Like, oh, it's always been like something I can dream of doing, just getting on the back 40 with my cabless tractor and plowing the soil. And I'm like, plowing? We practice no-till regenerative agriculture, sir. But, like it's they have this vision, but it's not correct. And I think it's important to try to connect people to what we do, and the passion and stewardship that we have for what we do, if we want to continue to be able to do what we want to do. Because it doesn't really matter what we want to do politically, unfortunately. It matters what the big urban populations want to do, and it's a big deal. So anyways, we want to connect as much as we can.
No, for sure. Yeah. Well, like any business, like any endeavor out there, right? It doesn't work unless you have eyes, you have ears on you. Someone knows what you're doing, and then they could spread that word. So, well, I hope we can definitely do that for you, Matt, and Makers. Just having you on the podcast today. Yeah, that's neat. And I like that what you mentioned about the expansion and I guess agritourism. So that's, I guess, another way that it would drive some, recognition of what you're doing. Do you have like a vision of what that might look like? Would some people, just tour the plant? Would there be some other sort of, entertainment, or, how would that tourism aspect look?
Well, I have a total vision. Yeah. I mean, it's
lay it on me. I want to hear it.
It's one of those things where it's like, you start talking about things early, and then things change, and you're like, somebody's going to get mad. But, so right now our malt house is in the town. We decided not to put it on the farm initially because of things like concern about water and water quality and hardness and all the little technological things. But we kind of want to move. We don't want to put it on our farm, but we want to move the next facility out into a field where we would actually have an active, legitimate Western Canadian sized farm happening on site, right? And so you come up the drive, and here's some fields of barley that are going to actually go into this malt house and then be produced into beer that you can consume on site here, because we also kind of want to be a bit of a cellar door for the people that we supply. Oh, cool. And so you would have that, both of those, the full circle there, right? And every year we do variety trials and agronomic trials, and we also partner in a ton of research. So we're partnered with the University of Saskatchewan on their barley research trials. University of Saskatchewan is almost for sure the best barley researching university in the world. Like, they're amazing. Naturally. They produce Harrington and Copeland, which are the two biggest barley varieties, if you're going to count them back to back, like probably into the, maybe even touching the 80s till today. So like, wow. Really, really strong program, great people. And I'm a little biased, but I don't even have to be, because they really are. So they do their research trials, and then we work with the CMBTC, the Canadian Malt Barley Technical Center, on some projects. Right now we're working on a hull-less barley project with them. And so we grow those in our fields, and the vision would be to grow them on the field adjacent to the malting facility. And then you would have some of the malting process, on display. So some of malting is really aesthetic and interesting and tactile and aromatic and all those things, and other parts are like really dusty and not that fun. So you kind of have the fun parts on display, maybe there's interactive whatever tours and stuff like that, which we do a bit of now. And then you kind of hide away the really loudest, dark,
Dusty, dirty,
dustiest
big
things.
clunky noises and things. Of course,
Yeah.
there's always a dirty side to things.
Yeah, so those are kind of in a building that's maybe less front facing, right? And that's kind of like, there's so many little like avenues that we go, because we're like right on the edge of the coniferous forest, and lots of indigenous sites are near us. The northern stars are near us, so like you kind of get into like the pure tourism side, and we're a gateway to lots of interesting things that way. And yeah, probably you have, if you've ever been to one of these farms, there's a couple in the Orlando area that you go to and you're like, this is more of a show than a farm. I think we would have a little bit of that too, because it makes it fun, but I strongly want to keep it more of a farm than a show. So it's like kind of like, I don't know, there's a bit of a balance to take there. And I feel like we have a great vision for it. And we've got some really neat tech that I think is going to be helpful in keeping us, our carbon footprint down and our sustainability sky high. And so there's lots of cool and exciting things about it. I'm kind of working through a lot of those this winter, and working on the feasibility of some of the ins and outs there. So we'll see. It's not here yet, that's for sure.
That's awesome though. It sounds like you got you got a whole bunch of ideas in a line. You're just working on it. That's great. And I love that idea. It's sort of like anything, right? So you try to make yourself stand out a little bit. And I think the fact that you can focus on the farming of it, but then add this tourism twist to it to bring those extra eyes and bring the interest, I think is really, really special. Well, actually, maybe to that, being, I guess special in something that makes you stand out from others is seen as also as like a competitive advantage. So I know you're working on that, but maybe in terms of some of your competition, maybe it's bigger maltsters or other local craft maltsters. How do you guys fit in with that competition? Do you see yourselves having like an edge? Is there a really big competition there? This is something maybe I'm not super familiar on. Maybe you can give me a little perspective.
Yeah, so I think like the most interesting thing about being a craft maltster in Saskatchewan that also farms is that our problems are so different than some of the guys that are also guys and girls that are in the Craft Maltsters Guild with me. And so the thing that we have on our pro side or our easy side is our quality, our supply, our proximity to our supply chain of our raw ingredients. And then on the difficult side, we also have some of the world's largest malting companies within a 2-hour drive. At least we have one, and they're owned by, it's Prairie Malt. They're owned by Burt Malt, who is a multinational out of Europe, largest malting company in the world. So economies of scale is a game that you can't even approach. And this is literally like AB InBev versus whatever any small craft brewery that you want to walk down past in Toronto. And that is like the difference in scale between us and Burt Malt. And so they're able to produce malt because of that economy of scale so much more cheaply than we are, that we can't even really say that we're doing the same thing. But at the same time, even though I don't consider us to be doing the same thing, they do tether our price a bit. So they're so close. They're still local, really, right? Not locally owned, but local production. And it's just, if you're in Brooklyn, if you're a craft maltster near Brooklyn, you don't have that pressure. And so if you're looking at selling your malt at X dollars per bag, you're not thinking, oh, I wonder what the biggest malt company in the world's selling theirs for per bag, because at a certain point, even though this guy loves this philosophy, Mr. Craft Brewer down the road here in Saskatchewan, you can only push so far, I feel. That's what I feel. And so that's the most difficult part, I think, about being in Saskatchewan. The second One would be that our population is 1 million, and it's not a massively mature craft beer market, although it gets better every year. So those are kind of the two things and that I find. So we differentiate ourselves by being unique, by making specialty malts that were previously imported, by being small batch, traceable, kind of by having that personal relationship and that customer service where, like, if you call about a bag of malt, you're probably calling me almost for sure. I had something to do with processing it in the malt house, probably self-delivered it, grew it. Like, we could probably figure out whatever problems you might be having, right? So those are all ways that we differentiate ourselves. In terms of craft maltsters, despite the prairies having so much production, they don't have a ton of consumption. And so, in Saskatchewan, we are the only malt house, craft malt house. And well, that's a tough question because I'm biased, and it's like a conflict of interest, but I feel like we are accessing everybody that wants to use craft malt and able to service them pretty well. And really the only place that you can go is by doing what we do at a lower price. I think. I mean, you could probably find little niches, but it's hard to go smaller. Like we really only have one full-time employee and myself, and I don't pay myself out of the malt house, not a cent. I live off the farm.
Okay.
And so and we really don't have the capacity, at least with what we're trying to do with growth and everything else, to pay out more, I look at the model, I look at what we're doing, I'm like, it'd be pretty hard to do it a different way unless you're going to be like, I'm going to do, 500 pounds a week and roast them with tarragon or something. I don't know. Do something really crazy.
Yeah, really outside. But I don't know, those are great points though. Like even what you're doing right now and those differentiating factors, you could trace everything that you've malted. I think that's really interesting and important, just for the fact that if something goes wrong, you have a trail, but it's nice to know that also that you're going to be the one that they call and you're going to be the one that's customer service based and you're delivering it. We're small business owners here at Rolling Hops as well, and our partners are in turn also small business owners. I feel like there's almost a bit of camaraderie there. And at the same time, it's nice to just talk to the same person for the stuff that you need, whether it is not super urgent, but when it is, you know who to call, where to get your answers, and there's some, I guess, security in that, at least my own perspective. So I think those are great differentiating factors for sure.
Yeah, I do agree with what you said on the that relationship between small business owner to small business owner, and especially in our industry, we've been through very similar things very recently. Most of the craft breweries are even under 5 years old. I would say the majority, for sure most of them are under 10 years old, and that startup feel, that startup push and workload, financial pressure, frustrating, lags in your startup, the timelines that you're trying to draw up, and just all those things they're just so reminiscent to all of us right now because we just did them, or some guys are into that place where, and we just expanded for the first time or whatever, right? So yeah, I feel like everybody's different, but we've had a very similar experience over the last 5 years in the craft beer and supply chain scene in Saskatchewan. So there's this kind of camaraderie coming through a bit of the fire there. And then of course the pandemic hits and you're like, okay, now we're all going through this fire, right? So yeah, you kind of, hopefully you can help each other out a little bit, lean on each other where you need to, and at least talk shop and kind of, commiserate or celebrate whatever the
Yeah, depending what time it is, and
yeah.
exactly. That's good. Cool. So I did want to talk a little bit more about the malts, and getting back to a little bit what you said about research and how you change those sort of things. Because I imagine, in craft beer, things change quite often. And, the root of all craft beer is the malt. So, you said you get some feedback from some of your customers on, maybe changing the malt, or requesting something special. So what does that look like? Are they asking for different types of grains, or different, maybe the same grains, but malted differently? What are some of those requests look like?
Yeah, so you get a lot of different thoughts, and some guys are like notorious, like, could you do this for me? And I'm like, no, come on, like I'm trying to like, do what I'm doing here, and it's already crazy. But so some guys have so many ideas, and you gotta kind of love it. But a lot of times I would say that there's a bit of like a feeling out process. I'm there a lot of times, like on deliveries and whatnot. So you get to talk, and you hear from the buddy, okay, we can't get any caramel malts that are locally produced. We're always having to import, or we're buying something that's from a big company that comes through one of the big distribution groups. So you don't have to tell me that very many times before I'm like, I got to see if I can make that, because it's kind of like a win-win. It's definitely an opportunity for me to like find a product that I can, just jump right in on, that they would love to see local, right? And so in that case, it's not even really a request, but just like a little vacuum in the supply chain that you like, hey, we could do that, right? A lot of times we get people that are involved in special projects. Like I just had a request from a Manitoba brewer to get a Manitoba grown barley malted and turned back around to him for a project where they needed everything to be grown local, and there's no maltster out there, so we could step in and help out with that. Whereas if they couldn't find us, basically that project doesn't exist, right? So sometimes it's okay, we need something grown by a Manitoba farmer, or maybe it's a company that says we want our barley variety that we're coming out with malted. Can you do that? So, you kind of work with all those. And then other innovation, trying to decide if it's more like push or pull. Like we have a lot of, it's probably not a smart thing to say, but halfway through saying it, but I feel like we have a lot of things where we think they should, if we build it, they will come, like,
Right. Yep.
It hasn't necessarily been asked for, but we feel that it's needed anyways. And
got a good hunch.
yeah, like one of the things that I think was really neat about our last crop year is that we did on our agronomy trial. So agronomy is the science of farming. And on our agronomy trial, we tried something that I think like most farmers would be like, what are you doing? That's nuts. And like our farm would have said that too 4 years ago, but we've kind of worked ourselves to this spot through our trials. And we added like 0 nitrogen to a part of our field. And that 0 nitrogen, it's got a great like sustainability story. Nitrogen's probably it's for sure one of the top carbon intensive things that we do in farming is add nitrogen fertilizer. Mm-hmm. And so we were able to take an area, add no nitrogen. What happens with that typically is that you decrease your protein levels of your barley, and you're also probably going to give up some yield. So that's why it's not a regular practice. But we decrease that protein. It processes through our plant really well with hydration happening fully and quickly, and it develops lots of extract for the brewery. So extract translate basically to bang for your buck, brew house yield, more beer per bushel, right? And so people really like that. But the interesting thing that we found out from it is that the flavor profile was really cool. It was like all the things we normally get, like the malty sweetness, kind of a little crackery stuff in our base malt, but it also had a little bit of a floral kind of undertone. And I thought it came through our malt sensory as the best thing we had. So that was like an example of how an innovation happens, I think, too, is that we kind of like push it and then they get a chance to try it. And you know what? If the proof's not in the pudding, it won't go anywhere. But if it is, all of a sudden you have like a product that, okay, we can like talk about and tell more people about, and people are going to glom onto it for different reasons. So I feel like there's been a lot of that, a lot of kind of, you know, what can we do, and then try to create the market for it. And then, yeah, a lot of times people are like, we need this, we need that, and we try to make it. Sometimes it's like, oh, like I have this malt from this particular company and I really love it, but it comes from Germany. Can you do something like that? Right. And so there's quite a bit of that type of thing too, where you're trying to almost make your own version of something that people are already using, I guess.
Yeah, fair enough. I can see that being very common. Obviously, you know, there's the many different styles of malt in the world, and maybe they've tried something before, and now they found you, and they see if you could do something similar, and want to support you in doing that. I can see that for sure. Yeah, that's pretty neat. We're coming up just on our time here, Matt. It's shocking that we're going by so quickly here, but I don't know. Maybe just to wrap it up, is there I don't know. Maybe what's your favorite malt and why?
Well, I really like the malt I just told you about, the low protein one. But one of the favorite malts from our malt house is our Maker's Midnight. And it's because it's the darkest malt we make. It's got like this kind of like old world red wine flavor profile with like the stone fruit, raisin, bit of roastiness, really full body. So I love the flavor profile. And we basically made it kind of with total disregard for like normalcy and recipe, and we were just like, let's try to make something crazy and dark and deep, and we kind of did, and we really didn't know. It took a lot of cleaning afterwards of like caramelized ducting, and it was just like, that was so kind of stupid and crazy, but we really like it. So that's probably my favorite one from our group. Yeah, I got a question for you guys.
Sure.
What came first, the podcast or the tours?
Great question. The tours came first. Okay. We were a craft beer tour experience company first and foremost. And then, yeah, we jumped on to doing a bit of a podcast. You know, the pandemic slowed things down, of course. You know, our main events are walking tours. Yeah. So then we switched up and wanted to keep some content flowing. We worked on some videos. You know, we have Craft Brewery series that we showcase breweries all across Southern Ontario. You know, do other videos, and then we figured, hey, we can give a podcast a shot. You know, we know of a few local craft brewers that'll jump on with us right away, and we'll see who else might be interested. And it sort of took off from there. And now it's flying. Like I don't know if we're overly popular, you know, by any means, but we've had a really great time in talking to a lot of different craft brewers, a lot of different other professionals in the craft beer industry, and we've learned so much. And you know, if we enjoyed a little bit, someone else might as well, and that resource there might be nice.
Awesome. And do you see a bit of craft malt out in your, you know, the places that you frequent? Or do you not get into that conversation much?
We do, not very often. We have talked to some local craft brewers, and
there's the alarm.
There's the clock.
Okay.
All right, Andy, we'll get Andy to edit some of this out, but
yeah.
No, I will answer your question. I'm just gonna wait for it to stop. It's a family heirloom.
That's awesome.
But yes, to answer your question, you know, when we speak with some of our local craft brewers that we're, you know, in touch with quite often, and they do like to try and use as much local, you know, overall, as many local ingredients as they possibly can. And I think it's becoming more and more popular to use more local craft malt. Sometimes, you know, what they're looking to brew doesn't always show up at their local craft malt supplier. So they'll maybe import it at that point in time. But we are finding in our conversations that it's becoming more and more popular to support your local maltster. So
Awesome.
can't lock it in, but I'd say that the trend is growing for sure.
Awesome. Well, that was a lot of fun. Appreciate I agree that went fast. I mean, I told you I can like kind of ramble a little bit because I got a lot to say on this topic, but
no, that's okay. That's perfect.
Hopefully it worked out okay.
It worked out great. Well, Matt, thank you so much for coming on the Beer Bound podcast. For all those listening, if you want to check out Maker's Malt, makersmalt.com. And yeah, maybe we can have you on again. It'd be really good. I know this went by really quick, so we can definitely come up with some other stuff to chat about.
Awesome. Well, you have a great night, and check us out. We'll check you out. We'll let us know when this episode comes out, tag each other, and get it out there.
For sure. Yeah, sounds great. Thank you, Matt.
Okay. All right. Have a good one.
Cheers. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all our interviews and beer-related content. Remember, craft beer is here.